It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. And I've had a little look at the programme of workshops and things that you've been looking at over the week, and it's a shame that I haven't been able to engage more in it because I'm really interested in a lot of the themes that you've been looking at. So I think it's probably fair to say my theme is about social capital, so obviously working in social action and in the voluntary sector, but hopefully there are some other themes that I'll kind of cut across as I speak and just talk a bit about my experience and the experience of my organisation and the work we're trying to do in terms of the transition of this city. So I've coined my talk, Social Action for Social Justice, because the voluntary sector is a social justice sector, but I think perhaps in more recent times we've been stepping into a space created by austerity that has meant that some of that mission has been a little bit adrift. And I see it as my mission to support the sector to really tackle inequality and get really focused about that. But I also recognise the challenges in doing it. So what am I going to talk about? I thought it might be useful if you're not familiar with voluntary action organisations, because there is quite a network of us across the UK, to hear a little bit about the roots of my organisation, because next year we are 100 years old. So there's quite a lot of history to learn from. And I would like to engage you in that learning journey, because we're doing something over the next year to try and understand a bit more about that. I'll also explain to you what a local infrastructure organisation is, because not many people know. And then I'll obviously touch on inequality in Sheffield. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I've just got a couple of slides which I think encapsulate the level of inequality we have in Sheffield, but then talk about the sort of challenges that we face as a sector of organisations and activists and what we're doing and how difficult it is actually for us, but also what the opportunities are. And then I'm going to talk about a bit of work we're doing in the city, because we have framed some city goals, which are like our North Star for transition, and we are aligning behind that kind of direction and building some infrastructure. And I just wanted to share a little bit about what we're building with colleagues and partners across Sheffield. So moving us on, Voluntary Action Sheffield is 100 years old next year, and is one of many place-based organisations, often charity and or social enterprise, offering a core infrastructure role to support voluntary community, social enterprise, faith-based organisations in delivering social action at place. Because of the age of our organisations, I think we're often seen as a bit of an institution in Sheffield. VAS, as we're often called, is referred to as an institution. And it's because we have a lot of history, and I think also the journey of our organisation has led to us kind of having that kind of status. But really, we want to understand a bit more about the history of social action in the city. So kind of moving away from one organisation and reflecting that Sheffield has a really rich history, very much at neighbourhood level and at citywide level, in people taking action for social justice. And there's such a rich seam of different people and organisations that we want to speak to. So we've commissioned a small group of volunteers to start to research and pull together information from both Sheffield archives, but also to do some learning and kind of journalism really with people who are still with us and able to tell the story of change in the city. And I think it's so important to reflect on our history in order to inform how we tackle the challenges of today. And I think we're sort of coining that work in terms of the calling question for the research. 100 years of social action, what does it tell us about the challenges we have today and how to face them? What can we learn? How can we accelerate that journey? So we would, of course, welcome the support of any researchers or academics with an interest in that topic or any of the subtopics that are within that group to help us take that work forward. We think it's a really rich gift to the city that we want to present next year when we turn 100 as part of our celebrations. We'd really like to tell that story out in communities and take perhaps an exhibition around at local neighbourhood level so that people can connect with the past more effectively. Okay, so this is my organisation today, and this is the vision of my organisation. It's what we work towards. We have a clear mission to tackle inequality. That's our remit, and it's within the space of social action. The term I use to define all activity that myself, other organisations, activists have is social action. We're often referred to as a sector, and I'm increasingly rejecting us being referred to as a sector because it's becoming synonymous with services and things we produce. But actually the sector, as it was, the social action is an organic ecosystem. So within Sheffield, we have lots of different organisations of different sizes, and there's lots of interrelationship that we have to see and understand to really work out how we become the most effective we can in the space we're in. So we recognise the inequality we see in the city, and we're committed to tackle it, but we also recognise the decline of systems and the need for transition to new ways of working and governance and the scale of that challenge. For example, our health system, my organisation, and I sit on a couple of health boards within the city, and the health system and the paradigm of the NHS, the majority of the spend in the NHS is about treating illness, where the majority of the spend is in secondary care, and we have a predisposition towards pharmacy, whereas social action and social justice mission is to support people to create better health and better opportunities, live fulfilling lives, and we want to develop the infrastructure that enables that. So speaking of roles, it's worth looking back, and my next slide really is about the history of VAS. So the Voluntary Action Sheffield as an entity has existed at least since 1926 when it was incorporated, but we suspect it will have been around in some shape or form from before that time. Unfortunately, all the records for that organisation were destroyed in a fire in 1940 during the Blitz, when the offices at Surrey Street were destroyed. But we do know from historians that have helped us to do a bit of research that, as it was called back in 1926, Sheffield Council of Social Services was established at a time when public services were really being pioneered and developed at quite a rapid rate within the charitable sector. And it was very much at the forefront of this work of developing services to people and to frontline delivery. So the principal role of the Council for Social Services was to provide a base for all of those different new pioneering services to come together and coalesce and connect and fill gaps where there was perceived to be a need, and to give support for other charities in the city that were delivering services and support. So in Sheffield, this included the sort of level of social services and range included running clubs for the elderly, managing trust funds, so managing money, managing resources, running residential homes, and even providing Meals on Wheels, supporting child adoption, blood transfusion services, and family planning services. So back in the 1920s, that was a huge range of services that were being developed by charitable organisations and housed within the Council for Social Services. Later on, it had offices built on Division Street in the 1960s to house the growing array of services and offer that it was making to the city. But of course, an important landmark was the Beveridge Report in 1941, which started to set out the kind of welfare state and the economic case for investing in state support. And I think the reforms brought in through Attlee's government in the 1940s recognised and started to set up the welfare state, which has obviously hugely developed over the years. So the role of us has shifted. And I think it's worth making this point in particular, that the birth of the welfare state, as Beveridge saw it, he saw the welfare state working very much in tandem with the charitable sector and recognised the strengths of the charitable sector working with it. Of course, that relationship has had different tension over the years, and there's been different direction from different governments. But I make this point here because how this plays out locally is very much how we work with local government and local public sector. And the ideology between kind of state socialism and communitarian socialism is a really tricky one that we play as a sector, as a movement of social action. Because ideologically, if you believe in sort of very big state socialism, you might not value the work that the sector and things that we're doing as much as if you're at the other end of the spectrum. And I think we play out in a lot of different framing of politics as a movement within the city and nationally. So VAS were doing a lot of frontline services, but during the 1980s, they worked to transfer a lot of direct delivery functions to the public sector, as it was now established, and to other charities, and decided to concentrate on becoming what's called a second-tier organisation, like a development agency, supporting the wider sector, and that's the role we play today. We had a growing range of specialist services, so withdrawing from frontline services meant that we could work on more infrastructure for organisations, so supporting them with access to finance, structured finance, and getting to that kind of field of funding specialism, organisational specialism, and volunteer support specialism. So I think in the late 80s, we actually changed our governance arrangements to reflect that we would become a membership organisation. So VAS today is made up of over 300 members who decide on who sits on our trustee panel, for example, but we're very much a member movement. So we talk to and take soundings from the voluntary sector in the city in order to inform the work we do. We listen, take insight, make sure we take that into the spaces where we're representing the sector. So that's the story to today. And then just a little bit about the 4 key functions of local infrastructure. So VAS, like many other organisations, often we're called a Council for Voluntary Services, or we might have a new snazzy name. Some organisations have rebranded. But essentially, many of our organisations are members of an organisation called NAVCA, which is the National Association for Voluntary Community Action. And they've helped us to really just define the 4 key functions that we play. So we have a leadership and advocacy role. In Sheffield, this means that myself and colleagues from VAS and from the voluntary sector participate in governance and decision-making panels. So, for example, the Health and Wellbeing Board in Sheffield. The Health and Wellbeing Board met yesterday afternoon in a public meeting, and there were 3 representatives from the voluntary sector. One of them was my colleague. And that's our space at the table, not to represent the sector. I always say I cannot possibly represent thousands of organisations and individuals taking part in social action, but it is to bring insight into the board from people and communities, which is a massive strength of people involved in social action, and to identify opportunities, barriers, and influence decision-making on behalf of people and organisations that we network and speak to. We're involved in many partnerships and collaborations, and I think the key to all of our work with communities is about the value of diverse collaborations of people in the city in tackling inequality. That diversity is our strength, and as a collection of organisations and people, we use that wherever we can to bring fresh thinking to the status quo. We nurture those relationships. I would say probably 70% of my time is spent nurturing relationships with community leaders, with city leaders, and playing that role of connecting people to each other and crossing the streams. So the other 2 functions are to build capacity with that social action movement. So to enable people to have the funds, the skills that they need to be able to flourish and support people in their communities, to provide training, but also to support volunteering. So my organisation offers a volunteer centre and an online system so that people that want to volunteer in the city can easily have access to opportunities, and organisations can easily advertise and recruit people with particular skills to help them do what they need to do. We also support organisations with managing volunteers and making sure that that experience is mutually beneficial. So volunteering has got, as a term, has kind of a bit of a connotation that it's about the benevolence of one person. Actually, volunteering is a massively important source of building confidence, capability, experience for people. And we very much see it as part of a pathway into skills, education, and ultimately into work. But it has to be a mutual relationship. And that's something we're really passionate about. So our focus today, this is our purpose. So this is what we do, and our 5 priorities for how we do it. Our calling question as an organisation is something that we come back to on a regular basis. It's how do we put people and communities at the heart of our transition towards the city goals? And I'll come on to talk about the city goals. But we consistently raise this question when we meet with partners. At our AGM, we invited Councillor Tom Hunt, the leader of the council, to come and answer that question with us. And in all the spaces we're in, we are inviting people to come and answer that question with us, because we want the prominence of social capital and people-led change to be at the heart of all the conversations we're having. We see that as a key role for us. We can't represent everybody, but what we can do is represent the principle of designing systems around people and recognising their expertise. So our approach to working in partnership is really key. So how we go about this. So we are person-centred. We use a lot of outreach approaches. We've been working with sociocracy models of gaining consent and working with small groups in communities in ways that are accessible and that level the playing field and create safe spaces. That's really important. I will come on to talk about the importance of trust and how we gain trust. The voluntary community organisations we work with the currency of trust with their communities. So how we then approach having conversations and developing infrastructure has to be built on those values. So we work alongside organisations. Our desire really is to work alongside an organisation with a view to stepping back. That isn't always possible. In times of crisis, sometimes you just have to step in, do things for people. But we do have an objective too. It's an enabling culture within our organisation to come alongside and then step away and make sure that people feel resilient and organisations feel sustainable. In the current economic climate, that's really challenging for a lot of charities and organisations. But when we work in solidarity, we can repurpose money, we can collectively bring our skills and labour to the challenges that we face. So just a little on inequality in Sheffield. I've just got 2 slides which I think really summarise. We work with and recognise much more complex and layered map than the one I'm going to speak to. For example, racial inequality in the city, as highlighted by the Race Equality Commission a few years ago, gave us some really stark images about how people's lived experience of the city looks. And that included how organisations and people from global majorities found our services and how they found the voluntary sector. And the read across in terms of inequality was that within our sector, we have some serious work to do to tackle racial inequality. The barriers to funding, the barriers to inclusion in governance, for example. We are still a predominantly white governed city, and we are working on addressing that by working with groups of emerging leaders and giving them support. So on to inequality then. This probably is a map that is really familiar. We have an infamous east-west divide, which is not uncommon with core cities like ours. So neighbourhoods in the southwest of Sheffield are in the top 20% of least deprived areas in the UK, and those in the northeast of the city are in the top 20% of most deprived. And that's reflected in lots of different ways, but this is probably the most stark. So since the pandemic, the gap between rich and poor has widened in Sheffield. And probably in the most stark way, there is now an 8.8-year difference in life expectancy for men in the city and an 11.4-year difference for women between areas considered more affluent and more deprived. And this is a piece of work that was undertaken just before the pandemic, actually, along the route of the 83 bus route in Sheffield, which has become quite famous, because along that bus route you travel through different areas of the city. And I think Mayor Oliver Coppard often refers to this because he used to live at one end of it. But that gives us a kind of stark challenge, really, around the level of inequality that where you are born in the city will start to determine your chances and your life expectancy. So that widening inequality, together with the anticipated challenges ahead, an ageing population, a continuing housing crisis, economic inactivity, and the climate emergency, provide a scale of challenge that require really significant change in policy, systems, public services, and fundamentally our own choices as citizens. And we see a role in Sheffield in particularly supporting the citizen element of that. But of course, we work with partners across the whole piece. So in dealing with the challenges ahead, we need greater recognition, as I've said, that communities are expert in themselves. They know what is needed and how it can be best delivered. The COVID pandemic revealed the extent to which social action and the voluntary sector is at the heart of community and life in the city. It was a really important reminder for us, actually, about where trust is and where immediate response can be given. And in the years since the pandemic, there's been a national and local shift in recognition for the role that the voluntary sector plays in supporting people and communities when they need it most. But also there is increasing understanding that the voluntary sector and social action is representative of its people and communities and is much more, we are much more than service providers, we're stewards of social action and change. So Sheffield has an amazing, vibrant voluntary sector. We have over nearly 3,500 organisations and groups in the city. And this growing evidence that the benefits of the voluntary sector has created momentum, that understanding and revaluing of what we do, together with policy shifts in NHS and local government. We're getting greater recognition and more commonly getting a place at the table to try and influence local policy making. And with the changes that are due around devolution, we hope to be playing a really key role in bringing devolution down to a hyper-local level, which is really, really important for our city. So as I said at the beginning, the voluntary sector has massively stepped into the space of public services because of austerity, and there are real challenges in that in terms of financial constraint. But I think this slide just really reflects the kind of range of things that are happening. So the value of the voluntary sector is in a few areas. So one, our work bridges gaps in policy. Policy streams and policy decisions are often made in splendid isolation at a very local level. We're knitting together the impact of those decisions for local people. It's really hard work because you're also straddling budgetary streams and they don't always align, and knitting that together is really the challenge of our work. We mobilise action in a specific and targeted way. So we do understand things at the neighbourhood level, at hyperlocal, small group population level, and can target activity and can target some of that funding where it's needed most for people who are furthest away from services. And we can connect voices of people in a different way. I think we provide unique insight because we are constantly having conversations in communities. We're not doing a piece of engagement. There is just ongoing insight being gathered that's really valuable and really important. And we can alert early when things go wrong. In Sheffield, we benefit from a number of place-based and community of interest-based community anchor organisations. This is an example of one. It's Zest and it's at Upper Thorpe. You can walk into the door of this organisation and get support to get into work, to meet people, reduce your isolation, go to a pay-as-you-feel cafe, learn how to swim, a range of things. It is an amazing hub, it's an amazing asset. Sheffield has many of them, and we would like to develop and work with those anchors over the next year. And we've got some funding from Public Health to do so. Here's another one, which is in Burngreave. It's SACMA, which is a Sheffield African Caribbean Mental Health Association that's worked in partnership with a housing provider to open up some new housing and community space. So offering a range of services to people. So I'll just touch on the challenges. I think I've talked about the kind of financial constraint, and that's the climate we're all living in. But also within that constraint, it means that sometimes the way things are procured or how grant arrives is in a competitive environment, which has led to a bit of a competitive culture between organisations that ultimately should be working together. So we've got some work to do on our own culture. We need to get our house in order as a social movement. Our costs are unmet, so we are often subsidising the work we do through fundraising and other things. The ultimate price for the fact that we are underfunded is our people who are suffering from burnout. So a lot of our work in VAS is actually around supporting people with mental health, doing mental health first aid, trying to put that in place. And we recognise that's putting a sticking plaster on a much bigger problem, but it is needed, it's a crisis. So we recognise the importance of social capital, not just to resilience, but to transition. And we recognise that community organisations are working in asset-based approaches that we really need to learn from and do more of. and that the critical role of the voluntary sector to demonstrate and try different things and different ways of working together is a key piece of public sector reform. So we would really like the covenant that the government are working on with our kind of national organisations between the sector and local government is really important to get right. A final note on that kind of role around community activism is the campaign called We're Right Here, which is working to basically make sure that there is, in the devolution development, that greater community power is actually enshrined in law in that devolution deal. We want more opportunities for people to own assets in their community and to develop them on their own terms. So finally, to the Sheffield City goals. This is a recent piece of work in summer 22. The Sheffield City Partnership as well has asked a few of its members, including VAS, to work just as volunteers to bring together a working group with the core purpose of convening stakeholders and building a set of goals that challenged us and made us look up really as to where we wanted to be by the year 2035. And VAS played a role in that work to ensure that we held conversations out in a range of communities and with the diversity of voices being heard in that process. So particularly voices who are underserved and have been overlooked by previous engagement activity. So we worked with the voluntary sector to identify groups and went and held conversations very much in the way that those people wanted to hold them. So there was a lot of art activity, there were outdoor sessions. This is a beautiful piece of mapping work that was done by a group of ladies working with Family Voice at Common Ground in Sharrow. But those conversations ensured that we heard insight and learning about what local people's lived experience was in the city, what their aspirations were, and grounded the goals in the reality for many people. So the word safety is in one of the goals because for many people, just to be safe is an aspiration. And I think that was a huge grounding influence on our lofty kind of aspirations to do lots of different things. And actually, we need to reflect all of the population in that imagining. So the goals were published last year. There's a set of 6 stories that we want to tell about Sheffield, and they are deliberately and beautifully entangled, because I think in the past when we set goals, we tend to work in those policy silos and look at housing and look at transport. But actually the way the goals are written deliberately bring together the things that need to coalesce and that we need to hold on to and not separate. So bringing together shared prosperity with culture, with growth and entrepreneurial skills, green spaces and resilience and what that means to communities, being a welcoming city and showing care as a culture, not just a service or product, and people being able to live fulfilling lives within that context. So these are the 6 stories, and I won't dwell on them because you can go onto the Sheffield City Goals website and read more about how we involve people in bringing those together. But Voluntary Action Sheffield has signed up to those goals. They're part of our governance now, and everything we do, we're aligning behind those aspirations. And I think it's really helpful for focus and a common narrative across the city with other stakeholders. So what's happening now? We're working on some infrastructure. We've set a vision, we've set a direction. Now we recognise we need new infrastructure to involve more people and enable more participation than ever. And that's going to involve some structure and new governance for us, but also designing metrics that matter and are meaningful to people. So we have lots of data in the city. A lot of it is in separate places, and how we align that is a big challenge, data agreements and all of the kind of legal stuff you need in place. But actually, is it meaningful to most people? Or is who is it produced for? So arriving at a set of metrics that people can relate to and value is really important. We've set up Sheffield Stronger Together. So I mentioned Sheffield Partnership earlier, which was the former governance structure for Sheffield institutional leaders to come together. There's a new grouping called Sheffield Stronger Together, and it's a more diverse group of city leaders, and it's growing. We've just recruited some business leaders into that space, and we're developing our collaborative and shared accountability culture together. So recognising that needed to shift. The other builds that we're working on are next generation, so not just engaging young people to steward and be involved in decision making and shaping our journey towards the goals, but also being able to do that thinking and looking up at next generation. So decisions made today, how are they going to stand up in 10, 20 years' time, and bringing that perspective decision making? How do you build that into governance and make sure it's there and influencing? And then finally, the Demonstrators and Investment Fund is really about building infrastructure, about how money makes its way to the good ideas that happen in the city, without the barriers of formal grant funding and all the strings that often get attached to investment in other ways. The way we're looking at it at the moment is that might be quite micro investment for many people. If we look at a neighbourhood level, how do you get money to come down to that level and for people to make decisions about where it's invested? It doesn't have to be big money to make a difference to people. But also we want some investment into some of those demonstrator new ideas of bringing together the entanglement of different issues and working in that way. So developing the infrastructure to support that and where we get investment from and leverage into that is really important. And then finally, the bit I'm working on is neighbourhood conversations, which is about how we design infrastructure for community power. So we've identified on a map 147 neighbourhoods of around 4,000 population. And when I say we've identified, we put that out as an interactive map for people to self-identify. This is the neighbourhood I see, and literally draw a ring around it. And that led us to 147 neighbourhoods. In the city, we have 7 local area committees, which is sort of political governance space of 70,000 population. So we're now looking through the lens of a much more hyper-local geography, and that's really, really helpful for us in deciding what infrastructure we need to support it. But also we recognise that there is a lot of activity already going on at that neighbourhood level. So we're now in the process of developing a deeper map that's more than just drawing sort of circles and putting boundaries around areas, but diving into that space and saying what's going on here, what assets are valued by people, who are the people that are making things happen, who are the people that everyone goes to when they want a problem solved, and really understanding a sort of richness of data. And that work is all happening kind of in a live space. And again, if you go to the City Goals website, you can explore the maps that Tom French and Simon Duffy have been developing with the city. So I'll just finish on 3 points. Trust, I referred to it earlier. We have to build trust with people. We are in a position where we need to work on our cohesion. We're in such a polarised sort of narrative nationally and publicly that building trust is person by person and doing the work to bring people together. And I think the work at that hyperlocal neighbourhood level is a space where we can build safe spaces and build more trust together, which is absolutely imperative for participation. We need to nurture leadership. A lot of our work in VAS is working with younger people with a focus on what do Generation Z think about social action, because I think they have some very different ideas to the established leaders in the city, and we want to hear them and understand it and see how we can work with them. And then finally, we need to reframe value, and I think this is my final kind of ask really to you as an audience, which is we need help to reframe that value. We need support from research, and we need research to be in service of community. The role that you play in understanding how things interrelate and how those policy streams cross or don't cross and how things play out at neighbourhood is really important. But people in communities need to build their own capacity and confidence. And you're in a unique position to develop a mutually beneficial relationship with the people that you work with in community and at place. So hosting and facilitating methodology and process so that we can all learn together and be empowered. So consider yourselves in a role of responsibility of empowering others, and I really welcome conversation and engagement with you on that. That's all I have to say. I think I've gone a little bit over time, but it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. I mean, that was really inspiring. And I mean, I've had the pleasure of meeting you over the last 18 months, and I think it's left me always with this really fizzy feeling. And the fizziness I've realised is probably part anger, part humility, but also a lot of hope, because there are some really different things being said and done in Sheffield, having spent like a long time in Manchester. And I think there's something about the way you're really bringing those academic ideas, the concepts that we work with, really to life. So thank you very much. So we're going to take some questions and then we'll have a response from David as well. So yeah, does anyone want to kick us off?
Yeah.
You're constantly struck that there's a huge amount of effort going on in localities.
They can't hear at the back. Sorry, could you use the mic?
Okay, so my question is maybe more a reflection that so many communities across the UK are likely to pick up the pieces as a result of the kind of the large-scale commitments to a market society which produced gross inequalities. And I sort of started off the session yesterday reflecting that there are 700,000 households in the UK that own homes worth more than £1 million. And so we're in a situation where it's completely off the cards politically to talk about, we can talk about wealth inequality, but what we can't do is talk about how we might extract a fairer contribution from those people who have not only staggering levels of resource, but have grown very wealthy as a result of the kind of choices that have been made nationally. So I'm going to the side or above the kind of things that you're talking about, which is to ask what more might we see at a national level in terms of leadership to produce the kind of resources that are needed to tackle the problems that everyone at the ground level is trying to pick up on?
Yeah, I think redistribution of wealth is a real challenge. I'm quite interested in, it is a national issue, and obviously clearly, economic policy can play a huge part in it. Political appetite, when you have the length of term of your typical government, is really difficult to affect that change and be brave. Doesn't feel like we're anywhere near that space. I know there has been a bit of a U-turn today about benefits, but we feel like a really long way away from that kind of thinking. I think at a local level, this is kind of what I hope for with devolution, because I think people, I've recently got really interested in the cooperative movement, and I've been to visit a couple of housing cooperatives. So kind of how people live in commune in a completely different, really getting away from that capitalist market model and what that takes. And I realise it's a huge commitment. I've been and met with people and understood it. But I am interested and kind of alert to it, and more people I'm speaking to are kind of going, actually, there's probably more I can do, and that is taking it down to an individual level, which is probably where I feel I can influence. I don't really feel I can influence those government things. But I think there is an example in Sheffield about some people that have got together and are just raising money from people like me, guilty middle-class people that have more than I need, to give money to be redistributed to grassroots working class activities. So there's like little bits of movement, and there's things that are happening that I think we need to look at what we can do and what we are in control of and how we can build that movement. That's more the space I'm in than I have less hope in big kind of government decisions, I think.
I have a question while people are thinking. I'll take chair's prerogative, but I can't see a hand. One of the things that really struck me was your phrase at the end about how deliberately and beautifully entangled all of the goals are. And it struck me because at the Urban Institute, we've been working with this idea of entanglement for some time, between people, their bodies, their brains, like the human being entangled, but then the systems that we're relating to and the policies and all these sorts of things. And then I was thinking today, there was that announcement coming from the top that the committee system in Sheffield is going to be abolished and being asked to go back to a cabinet model. And I'm thinking, well, if it's all so entangled, and entanglement is at the heart of Sheffield City goals, what does that mean? Because you shift one bit of the system that's enabling this kind of, nascent fizziness that I feel when I talk to you and some of your colleagues. Now, what does that mean? So at a very direct level for everyone else, so I waffled, what are the implications of the potential shift back from a committee system to a cabinet system for an organisation like yourselves?
I have to say that actually the shift, we were in that cabinet system a few years ago, and the shift has been fairly smooth, and there isn't a huge amount of difference for us. Like the number of relationships, perhaps, each committee has got a chair and a vice chair that ultimately probably add up to the same number of people that are in a cabinet. So in terms of the work, the labour, the relationship development and keeping track of things, it's probably about the work of the council is the same level of business, the same level of decision making. I would say actually it's probably accelerated because the council's doing a lot around its strategy and bringing strategy in and making sure that's in place. I guess there's a kind of question around local area committees, so how the council connects with people. But you will have heard, I'm an advocate for much more hyper-local connection anyway, in terms of those committees. Trying to connect with a population of 70,000, I think is really, really challenging. And so we're kind of almost saying that some of the infrastructure that we can see will support whatever system is in place for decision making. I think the other thing I would say is having no overall control, and actually the way in which politicians are working together has been a huge strength. Now that has happened at the same time as the committee system. So I think maybe that's more important rather than the actual structure of how things are made and where they're made. It's about who's making the decisions and how are we doing that together. And I think the period of leadership that we've had, with Tom as the leader, but no overall control in the council, has been a good period for Sheffield.
That's really useful because I think I've probably heard a little bit less about the role of the state and local governance and some of the things we talked about today. So we've got a question from Madeline, and then if no one else makes themselves known to me, I'm going to turn to David for a response.
Thanks so much, Helen. I share Beth's dizziness.
Urban fears.
So many comments, reflections, which I'm going to resist making, but I found it really interesting and powerful at the beginning how you're sort of challenging the language that does matter and rejecting that idea of sector and really pulling ideas of social action and using ideas of movements and movement building. I found that really powerful. I guess somewhat related to that, my question would be, if we're thinking about the state, and I guess following on from what you were just talking about, specifically, I guess, Sheffield City Council, I was really interested in some of the kind of draft language around community strategy and so on that they're working on at the moment, that they seem to recognise, or there's a phrase, when we need to get out of the way. And I found that actually quite powerful for the local state to admit, when do we, at least there they can see they're not everything to everybody and they do need to get out of the way sometimes, they can be an obstruction. And I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on that in Sheffield in your experience.
So, sorry, I've just had an ask from online to paraphrase the question. So it's a question around the local state, when should it get out of the way?
Yeah, that's so that quote is taken from the Sheffield plan. It's in the first page, and when I read it, I was like, wow, the council needs to understand when to lead, when to enable, and when to get out of the way. And I use it all the time because it's such good framing. It's good framing for me, it's good framing for all of us, because what roles are we? If we're going to act differently together, getting a sense of, is it me or who's going to build this work and work together? It's a really key question to ask about any collaborative work. It's like, what role am I playing here? So to hear it and to read it in the council plan was really refreshing. And yes, the way it plays out, I think it's a question that colleagues within the council are raising and I raise it sometimes, but often it's offered up to go, well, what is our role in this? And I think in a way, the community strategy is trying to sort of start to answer that question by listening to people. So what I'm offering up in terms of community action, I would advocate that really good community development work should be done by independent community organisations. I think that's where it's best done, where there's most trust. But I'm happy to have that debate with the local authority around, they have a role in that as well. So how do we enable that good work to happen together? And it really helps with the framing of those kind of operational conversations. And it varies, I would say. Like some people are more along that journey of exploring different roles. And I think it's all about your personal experience, isn't it? If you've worked in an institution for a really long time, that kind of the prevailing culture that you've worked in, you'll notice that my language is absolutely flip-flop between sector, movements, because I work within the culture of other institutions that are influencing me all the time. And it's really hard to assert myself and try and do that. So imagine working within an institution that's got lots of established kind of mechanisms and processes and systems, but people really are grabbing it and are being generous with that space to say, actually, what's the best thing to happen here? You know, what's the best thing to happen around community development? What's the best thing to happen around how we work with food in communities? So, you know, we play different roles. I can give you a good example of food because we work with setting up food co-ops with groups of residents. So that's our offering about something that empowers people with food. We no longer support the food bank network. That is a network, they've got peer support and they're supported by the council, but the role VAS are playing is to look at different models with food. We're increasingly looking at how people can grow food, because now they're getting together and self-organising around buying food. They're naturally interested in where the food comes from and whether they can be a source of that. So, you know, the role we're playing there, we're being enabled by the council, but we're taking a lead on it. In supporting the food crisis, I would say the council are taking the lead on that, and then we enable very often and support groups. So that's a really practical, pragmatic example of playing different roles. And that's been quite conscious more recently. I think to start with, it wasn't, we were just doing our own thing, but now it's kind of, we're maturing and going, okay, this is the role we're playing here, and understanding how that works. And that's only going to build and grow, I think, in other parts of our work.
Thank you very much. So it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to, you've made an ask of us, and I'm happy to reply by saying I would very much like to sit down with you and think about how the Urban Institute and Sheffield Urbanism, all of our colleagues, can support you in your 100-year anniversary. And yeah, I think I won't be here in 100 years, or at least I did, until all of these conversations about AI, because there is now a digital afterlife and a gospel bot that can guarantee.
I look forward to that.
Yeah, great. I don't think I meant to end there. Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So we also have with us today our visiting researcher, Dr. David Dogman, who is the General Director of the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. And David's also done lots of work with the UN, co-authored parts of the World Cities report, and looked at a lot of these questions around urban inequalities and marginalities and vulnerabilities around the world. And so David's here and has kindly offered to give a kind of response that's maybe responding to sort of what's happening in Sheffield with some examples from around the world. So we're going to take a few moments for a response from David, and then I will hand over to Hannah, who's going to close the conference for us. So I've asked David to reflect a bit from his own experiences on what he's heard Helen say, but also maybe just to share with you some reflections on what he's heard from the conference today.
Indeed. Great. Thank you, Beth. You never shy away from giving me difficult tasks like making comments after a presentation. It's been so rich and detailed and meaningful. And also a difficult task on a warm Friday afternoon for to say something that might hopefully adds a little bit to the conversation, with all the risks that an informal and fairly unprepared set of comments are becoming vague and rambling. So I will try my best not to do that, and I'll also try my best to do a couple of things. Maybe to bridge some of the some of what Helen has spoken about to other contexts. And I think that's always one of the things that impresses me when I engage with Sheffield Urbanism and the Urban Institute, is the way in which the work is both extremely globally relevant, but also very much locally rooted. And so if I can make some of those bridges between the specificities of social justice and social action in Sheffield and some of the global trends in in urbanism, and in particularly in how inequality is manifested and addressed by critical activist groups around the world as well. So as Beth said, I work at the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, which is in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. My first bridge really is to speak about how what the Sheffield experience resonates in another large post-industrial city in Northern Europe, which also I think resonates in other places as well. I mean, I was really struck by the east-west divide. In Rotterdam, we have very much the north-south divide, and Rotterdam Zuid, Rotterdam South, is very much a byword for urban deprivation in the Netherlands as a whole. But the way in which the term and the geography of Rotterdam Zuid is also appropriated by the people and the organizations from that part of the city, and the term is appropriated and used as a basis for resistance to some of the deprivations that are associated with the area, and is used as a badge of honor for coming up with alternative ways of visioning the city and acting in the city. It's also a very diverse city, is Rotterdam, and there were comments on some of the racial and ethnic dynamics in Sheffield too. And it's always been a diverse city. So currently there's more than 180 nationalities living in the city. The first magisterial urban geography book about Rotterdam was published in 1952, The Growth of the Great Working City. And the authors of that book talked about how it took 2 or 3 generations for people who had come from outside, and there had been waves of migration even before the 1950s. That it took 2 or 3 generations for the migrants to become part of the city. Nowadays, and I hope there's no Dutch people because I'm going to give a sentence of Dutch, so I won't embarrass myself or the Dutch people. Nowadays, you can buy a t-shirt that says, "De echte Rotterdammer komt van buiten." A true Rotterdammer comes from elsewhere. So again, an appropriation that migration is a fundamental part of the city's story, and the things that make people often seen as outsiders are actually things which make them a genuine part of the city. And that's manifested in uneven ways in the governance situation. So Rotterdam was the first large Dutch city to have a mayor of non-ethnically Dutch origin, Ahmed Abu Taleb, who was a mayor of Moroccan origin for 2 terms in the city. So there are bridges and there are resonances to urban experiences elsewhere in Europe, but there are also bridges and resonances to urban experiences around the world. And most of my work has been done in cities in Africa and Asia and the Caribbean. And here I was very struck by some of the observations of how voluntarism and voluntary action operates alongside the state. And of course, in many of the contexts in low and middle income countries, and there is a lack of capacity, a fundamental lack of fiscal capacity by the state, a fundamental need for basic services, for housing, and for many of the social services to be provided by organizations and groups other than the state, whether they are faith-based groups and whether they are community organizations of various kinds. And so Helen talking about how voluntarism bridges gaps or looks at the role of the state and the social sector. This resonates in urban areas around the world, where we use terms like co-production to explain how urban services is provided in a way that both uses local action and local inputs alongside the formal actions of the nation state. Some of that then I think links to what I've heard during this week, and I was part of a grant writing workshop on climate pluriversations on Wednesday, and I was able to be here for the, particularly for the children and youth sessions earlier today. And I think that when we use something like climate as a lens for understanding inequality, that's helpful as well. It's both helpful as a conceptual framing, as a lens to understand how in a particular sector, if it is a sector, a particular domain of action, but also as a significant global challenge which comes up, which also manifests itself unevenly in terms of who is affected and who has the capacity to respond. So climate action and climate inequality as a key urban issue, thinking about the way children and youth have been presented here today. But particularly, I think, in the ways in which the more intersectional dimensions and the more intersectional social dynamics help to shape inequality and how we then need to respond. I think I would say that the strengths of some of the inputs and the presentations have been that they've gone beyond naming inequalities. Of course, this is the first and essential descriptive basis, is to name and to describe what the inequalities are, whether they are spatial and whether they are social. As an urban geographer myself, very much focused on urban systems, what are the systemic dimensions of these inequalities. So we have to name them, but we also have to understand them. And I think that that's one of the things that's been striking in some of the early career work that I've seen the last few days, is a genuine attempt to try and understand the underlying, the systemic drivers of what's creating inequalities. Maybe by way of challenge though, and there's also something to be done about anticipating the future. What are the trends that we see, the macroeconomic trends, the infrastructural trends, the way in which private finance is reshaping the geographies of the city? What does that mean for how inequality will evolve in the future? And what can we be doing now to try and prevent that inequality from developing? Or also perhaps, what can we think about doing this in a genuinely transdisciplinary way? And by transdisciplinarity, I mean not only the way in which different disciplines inform each other, and I think I've seen some evidence of that, but also how the actual framing of the questions is shaped, not just between the policymakers or the not-for-profit sector or the community sector or the academic sector, but how the framing, how questions are framed jointly by these groups that then go into the analytical framings and for what can be done within the boundaries of the academy and breaking through the boundaries of the academy. So because it's a Friday afternoon, I think I will indulge myself with a quote from Marx to end the day. And I think that it bridges what Helen's been talking about and what I've seen in the academic more elements of the afternoon. And it's, of course, the quote from Marx's gravestone, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. And I think I've seen plenty of evidence from both sides, and that's what we're trying to do. So thank you and have a good afternoon.